Hello, I'm Dr. M. Welcome to VMC. Did you hear anything about Peanut the squirrel who was seized? And do you know the series of events that led to that squirrel being euthanized? How correct is a bunch of the information flying around social media? We're going to cover this story today from the perspective of a veterinarian. So join me, you'll learn something today. This story is more complicated than I had first assumed that it might be, so we're going to go back to the very beginning when a person named Mark Longo, who is currently in his mid-30s, he reported around 7 years ago that he was in New York City and he witnessed a squirrel that was hit by a car, and what he says is that there was a very young squirrel that ended up running over to him and climbing up his leg. So after this occurred, Mark says that the mother squirrel was dead after being hit by a car, and so he decided to take this baby squirrel back to his place where he then cared for it. Now, he has said in other interviews that proper wildlife rehab professionals that he contacted were too busy, and so that he was forced to care for the squirrel himself. And then after some time, he apparently did try to release the squirrel into his backyard. I don't know how long of a time period Peanut was on his own outside, but Mark Longo reports that eventually he saw that Peanut had been in some sort of altercation and his tail had been damaged, so Longo decided that he was going to bring Peanut back inside. Now, Mark Longo lives with his wife, Daniela. They report that they did set up a room for Peanut, and they also say that when they were home that Peanut had more free range of their home. I don't know where or precisely when the idea started, but eventually the Longos began posting squirrel content, mostly on Instagram, and at first this content was focused primarily on Peanut the squirrel. Over time, it shifted to where they were using Peanut as a draw in order to funnel people over to Mark Longo's OnlyFans, where he calls himself the Squirrel Daddy. The Longos really prioritized their exploitation of Peanut in order to drive their posts into various states of virality, and they ended up earning enough money off of Instagram and OnlyFans that this became the way that they earn their living, and they report that they also purchased the farm that they currently live on with this money. My dog is sound asleep and she's occasionally huffing and snoring. Let's take a minute to discuss the things that should have been done differently from the very beginning of when Mark encountered little Peanut as a very young squirrel. Now, the specifics of what the laws are do vary somewhat depending on exactly where you live. What's important for this particular story is that in the state of New York, it is illegal to keep wild animals unless you are a properly licensed wildlife rehab expert who is in the process of rehabbing that animal with the goal of eventually releasing it back to the wild where it needs to be. So from the very beginning, they should have been continuing to contact various rehabbers until they were able to find someone who had the knowledge and ability to properly care for a young kit so that it ends up being able to be released, be outside, and know how to care for itself when it's back out. This means teaching skills about foraging. It means having proper places for these squirrels to explore and live. It means being careful that you don't, as a human, make a squirrel that ends up being dependent on people. The goal is to put them back to live their best wildlife life. You can also contact places like veterinary clinics or animal control, as they may have further options and ideas to help you. And at the very least, like, I as a veterinarian will occasionally have a wild animal come in that's injured, and if it's determined that it won't be something that can be rehabbed, then there are some times where humane euthanasia is the kindest option for that animal so it doesn't suffer and die over an extended period of time outdoors somewhere. Now, if you decide I would like to be someone who is a wildlife rehabber. That can be wonderful, but you need to go about it the right way. That means gaining the knowledge and education about proper nutrition, proper behaviors for these different species, how they need to be cared for, what veterinary care they may or may not need, how to house them appropriately, and how to go about safely releasing them back into the outdoors once they are well enough to survive on their own again. There is so much work that goes into doing this properly, ethically, and legally. There is no evidence that anywhere that I could find that demonstrates that the Longos attempted to learn this information or get the appropriate permits, and they, by their own admission, had Peanut for over 7 years. They had plenty of time to go about doing this the right way if they'd been interested in doing so. So now that we've covered a bit of the origin story and how the Longos were very financially motivated to continue exploiting Peanut, let's move on to the next chapter of the story, because the Longos not only were keeping a wild squirrel, they also were keeping a wild raccoon that they named Fred. The Longos were allowing contact between the raccoon and the squirrel. This becomes more pertinent later, but just remember this in the back of your mind for now. So the Longos continued to post a lot of social media content about their illegal activities with Peanut and with Fred, and over time this caught enough attention from experts in wildlife rehabilitation and other people in the public, and there were some reports filed about the Longos and what they were doing. These complaints were made to the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York, which is the proper place to lodge these complaints. How Mark is putting this on social media that he was suddenly invaded by all these cops and blah, 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 is not giving you the full story of what actually happened. The DEC started their investigation in January of 2024 and have been attempting to work with the Longos since then. So the DEC has put out a statement. Part of the union's statement included information about how there were officers from the DEC who informed Longo that it is illegal to keep a squirrel or a raccoon unless you are a licensed wildlife rehabber who is in the process of rehabbing that animal so that it can be returned to nature once it's well enough. Longo told the people investigating these complaints that he had returned the squirrel to the wild and that all was well. Obviously, this was a lie. After Mark Longo had told the DEC this lie, they continued to receive complaints. Investigators ended up reviewing the social media accounts. There are a few of them, and they discovered that, yes, indeed, Mark had lied to them. Peanut was still in their care and had not been released at all. Because Fred and Peanut were still legally being kept by the Longos, eventually a warrant was issued. This warrant authorized the DEC to go to the Longos and to seize Fred and Peanut and remove them from the Longos' home. So there were 3 DEC officers who went to the 80-acre farm that the Longos have purchased with the money they've brought in exploiting Peanut over the last 7+ years. And then there were some investigators who were in plainclothes whose job it was to assess what illegal activities were ongoing on this farm. And lastly, there were 3 DEC wildlife employees who needed to be present in order to serve the warrant. As illegal activities were ongoing at the Longo residence, the DEC officers did seize Peanut and Fred from the farm. And here is where an already sad and upsetting story becomes tragic. At some point, a civilian wildlife biologist working with the DEC was bitten by Peanut through 2 pairs of protective gloves. Now you may ask, well, why is this such a big deal? People are bitten by animals all the time. Well, there is a significant difference between the risks to a person when a vaccinated animal like a dog or a cat bites a person compared to when a wild animal who has not had appropriate veterinary care bites a person. And the biggest thing that we as veterinarians think about is the risk of rabies. And in this situation, the risk is higher because in New York, raccoons are a known vector for having rabies. Fred and Peanut had contact with each other. So there is a risk of rabies transmission from Fred or from Peanut to any person that they bite. The next thing that you may not be aware of is that we only have one way to definitively test for rabies. And the only way we can do that is by actually sampling the brain of the animal. So to do that, the animal needs to be euthanized. It's the law that the DEC must report any bites and turn any wildlife that has bitten a person over to the public health department. So the DEC did turn Fred and Peanut over to the health department. At this point, of course, they are still alive. So the Chemung County's health department, where this all occurred, was then responsible for deciding what happens to Fred and Peanut after this bite. The law is to humanely euthanize wildlife who bite a person, to test them for rabies as soon as possible, because the presence or absence of a rabies diagnosis will dramatically change the risk assessment for all of the people who were exposed to those animals, and especially for the person or people who have been bitten. Now, if a pet bites somebody, in most places, if they're current on their rabies vaccine, we're legally allowed to put them into isolation for a period of time. It's often around 10 to 20 days, where they're in isolation away from human contact. They're monitored. If they do not show any signs of rabies over that time period, then they're allowed to return back to their family. But this is a wildlife situation where no vaccines have been given, and the raccoon especially is a known vector for rabies in New York. And I hope it makes sense to you that because rabies is essentially 100% fatal, we very much prioritize human health and safety over the life of a wild animal. Of course, I would far rather that this story had a different outcome. My preference would have been that the Longos would have turned Peanut over to an appropriate wildlife rehabilitation expert as soon as they'd found him. If that hadn't happened, then I wish that they would have taken the ethical thing to do upon themselves and went out to get the appropriate knowledge and licensing that they required so that they could have done right by Peanut and eventually released him back into nature. Unfortunately, this story is a case of a number of wrong decisions and years of exploitation of a wild animal. They had over 7 years in order to figure out a way to do the right thing and to not be continuously breaking the law in the place that they lived, but they didn't. It is the responsibility of public health to prioritize public health, and it's incredibly sad that Peanut ended up biting somebody and that this ended up resulting in the euthanizing of 2 animals. But for the Longos to whip up a social media frenzy about this, resulting in death threats to people who were only doing their jobs, is unacceptable, especially when the responsibility for what's happened falls on the Longos. It is their responsibility to learn what the laws are, to learn how to properly care for an animal that's come into their possession for whatever reason, and to do right by the animals that are in their home. I mean, yeah, it's a tragic, awful, sad story. And I'm sad that there was animal suffering that didn't need to occur. Anyway, I hope that you having this additional information, both about the situation that Peanut was in, as well as the presence of Fred, why that mattered, what laws were being broken, why those laws exist, and so on. I hope that all of that context helps you to understand. If you have a topic you'd like me to cover in the future, please comment it down below. I'd love to hear from you. I put up a new video most Fridays. YouTube thinks that you'll like this one. I look forward to hearing what you think about this complicated situation, and I'll see you next week. Bye.